I don't know about you, but I recently watched a video about a video game that was, according to the video anyways, fundamentally bad at being a game of the genre that it belongs to. I'm not gonna name the video or who it's from. I'm not interested in calling anybody out, because I think there's enough negativity on the internet already. But ironically, I found that video was fundamentally bad at being a video about the thing that it was supposedly about. And you know, I could sit here and now analyze this video, and I could basically make a review of that video and talk about why I think it was bad. But again, I think there's enough negativity on the internet already, so instead, I thought I might just do the opposite. Now, I'm not gonna make a video about the game that was being talked about there, talking about how it is fundamentally good, because I have actually zero interest in that game. Well, that's not quite true. I had zero interest in that game. But then I watched the video, right, and the guy in the video actually said, and I quote, "It's definitely improved on Wargame in terms of mechanics and stuff," unquote. That actually did make me kind of interested in that game, and I think that also illustrates why I think it was a very bad video at its intended purpose. Anyways, I still don't have enough interest in playing that game to actually make a video about that game. So instead, how about I make a video about a game that I think is fundamentally good? And I'm not just gonna make a video about a game that I think is fundamentally good at being a game in its genre. I want to make a video about a game that I think is fundamentally good as a game. And if you're not quite sure what the difference is, well, let me elaborate. You're probably familiar with the phrase "show don't tell" that movie people like throwing around. What this fundamentally means is use the strength of your chosen medium. In case of a movie, it'd be the visuals. So, you know, if you just have no visuals in your film, or most of the storytelling is coming from explicit dialogue, then you might as well just have written a book instead, or at least an audio drama or something, right? So in case of a video game, the fundamental strength is the interactivity, or the gameplay. And weirdly enough, there's a certain genre of video games that I think have been consistently pretty bad at implementing that. That genre I'm talking about is, of course, JRPGs. Now, before people come at me, JRPGs are my favorite video game genre. They're also the video game genre that I hate the most. JRPGs and me have a tough relationship. What I more specifically mean by that is some of the best gaming experiences I've had, just emotionally and otherwise, were JRPGs. Not all, but there's a disproportionate amount of JRPGs in my favorite video game list, if I had to make one. But at the same time, there's so many JRPGs, and to some extent also VNs, this extends to that as well, that I absolutely hate. And specifically for things like the writing and how they implement a lot of things. Anyways, this isn't about writing so much as it is about gameplay and how to integrate gameplay into your video game to tell a story. And the series I want to talk about here is Growlanser, a series that many of you might have never even heard of. It is not exactly well known, and I think that's a huge shame because here comes the title drop. I think Growlanser is a fundamentally good game series, I guess. It's not actually one game, it's multiple games. Well, the first one is, I guess. You could now call it Growlanser 1, but back then it was just Growlanser. Who cares? Growlanser does some things and is fundamentally designed in a way that really use player agency. And they do that in ways that are a lot less spectacular than people might first think. If you've watched my video on Kichiko Reigns, you'll know I'm a big fan of action and consequence over choice and consequence. Something I didn't hammer down in that video as much is that I do think that action and consequence is fundamentally a much more gamey way of handling this kind of thing. And I'm not using gamey in a negative way here. Lots of people like doing that. They say, "This is way too gamey for me." I don't know what the problem is with a video game being very much like a video game. Let's not open that can of worms, you know. I sort of get that there's instances where that word is used and I get what is meant by it, but I just mean in this case that this is very appropriate for a video game. And I think this is fundamentally a good way of integrating player agency, and player agency is really the show don't tell element of video games. There's a whole bunch of things to say about this, but One important thing, I think, is to know that player agency doesn't necessarily mean that the player can just make the story of a game go any way they want. That is already way too big. It can mean that, of course, but really player agency just means that fundamentally the player is the main driving force of everything that happens in the game. And not much will happen without the player doing anything, and depending on what the player does, different things will happen. Very roughly speaking here. Now, Growlanser. 6 games in the series. 4 of these are officially translated, the other 2 are currently in a fan translation process. I don't want to get too deep here, but I do want to give some examples of what I consider good implementations of player agency that are a lot less complicated, a lot less grandiose, but are actually the expressions of a fundamental approach that I think is really good and that more games should copy. There's other examples of this out there, you know, there's some interesting things to say about Silent Hill games, but today I'll talk about Growlanser because they have a whole series, 6 games, that fundamentally follows this approach to an extent that I have not really seen in many other games. Example number 1, the beginning of Growlanser 6. It's a scene we've seen many times before. Protag wakes up in a hospital bed, has amnesia, doesn't know who he is. Doctor walks up to him and is like, hey, here's your ID that we found on you, now have fun. Game starts. Players in control. What I first did when I played this is I walked up to the doctor, I talked to him, and I can ask him a couple of questions. One of these questions is, who am I? And of course he just tells us, well, just look at the ID I gave you. And then I do this. Did you notice what happened here? I hope you did. If you didn't, well, actually think of show, don't tell, but like one step further for video games. I'm pretty sure you've seen this kind of scene before. Character checks their pocket, suddenly finds an item in there that they have no idea how it got there. And this is that scene, but in gameplay form. This might seem extremely inconsequential to you, but it isn't. This is actually using game mechanics to convey something that they could have easily done in a plethora of other ways that didn't involve gameplay. They could have very easily had the doctor hand over the handkerchief along with the ID and say, we found this on you as well, or something. They could have easily had the character check his pockets as part of the cutscene. But no. They made it so that you have to find this item yourself. This also means that if you never check your inventory, you don't know you have this item. And there's actually a character very shortly after this you can give this item to. And this is another thing that's a little special about Growlanser as far as JRPGs go, because Growlanser makes you use items from your key item inventory explicitly whenever appropriate. So you can't just walk up to that character, talk to them, and because you have the item in your inventory, you will hand it over. No. You have to make the connection yourself that, wait a second, I have that handkerchief, go to the inventory and use it. And of course here we go into even further developments as to how this can affect the game later on, but that's not even the point. The point is simply, again, show don't tell, just with video games. I sadly cannot think of a good, snappy little sentence to encapsulate that. But this is that concept. If you can convey something through gameplay, do it that way. Now, I talked about action and consequence earlier, and of course that last example there isn't exactly action and consequence, at least not mechanically speaking, because there isn't a mechanical consequence of the player checking their inventory and seeing they have this item. So maybe you want an example that goes a little more into that direction. Well, I've got that too. Growlanser 3, again, very beginning of the game. I don't really want to spoil much about any of the games in the series here. There is this little encounter, and this is how it went the first time I played the game. I'm gonna speed up the footage here a little bit. The gist is, we fight this guy, and there's this thief that appears who's trying to steal the purse. We can fight him. And we get the button from the thief's jacket, and now throughout the rest of the game we can use this button on any NPC in the game, and it'll tell us whether the NPC reacts to it or not. And this leads into a whole side quest where, again, we have to constantly be aware of this being a thing. The game does not otherwise prompt us for doing this. We have to manually walk up to NPCs, use the button from our inventory, and maybe there's an NPC out there that has a reaction, and then this leads to further things. But here's the crazy part. Using the button isn't actually the thing I want to show you here. Because this is what happened on one of my other playthroughs of the game. Yeah, it turns out that if you don't immediately beeline it to the lady and the assassin, the fight just doesn't happen. The entire fight here is optional, and the entire quest line that comes along with it is also optional. And it's entirely based on whether you, in the moment of seeing this, immediately prioritize trying to intervene. If you don't, the scene will still kind of play out, and this is a very important aspect to all of this. Acknowledgement. It doesn't feel like you missed anything. There might be a little bit of this feeling in your head of like, could I have intervened? But what happened instead still feels like it might have also just been the way it's supposed to go. If you see this scene, you might not even think twice about it. You think, okay, that's just a weird scene that's supposed to foreshadow something, and I mean it does. But the fact that you could have intervened doesn't even necessarily cross your mind. But it might cross your mind, and if it does, and you actually try to do it, something else will happen. Especially on my first playthroughs throughout all of these games, there were a lot of these moments. There was a constant feeling of, could I have done something differently? Could this have gone in another way? And that is a sign of good integration of player agency. There are pitfalls to this. There can be a little too much of it. It can also lead to incentivizing safe scumming. You have to be pretty careful with this. You have to make sure that while the player might think it could have gone differently, it doesn't feel like it is imperative that he goes back and redoes what he did. And that's why, in some ways, having less story and general sort of routing consequences to it might actually be better. Because if whatever happens instead still works out, then the player will go, oh, I guess it was just supposed to happen this way, huh? Finding the right balance there is tricky, but it can be done, and I think Growlanser, for the most part, does it pretty well. Speaking of that, here's a third and last example of this. This one is arguably the simplest, a little more like the first one. I want to use this to, again, hammer down the point that integration of player agency doesn't mean that the player can change the entire game flow necessarily. You can actually do a whole lot with very little. So in one of the games, there is a bit where the engineer-scientist character that you have sends you on a mission to retrieve a certain artifact from some ruins because they needed to build something with it. So you set out to get the item, you do get the item, and then some other stuff happens in the course of that mission that is a lot more important. Everybody's now thinking about that, talking about that. You return to base. You're in this briefing room, which is also the lab where the science engineer character is doing their thing, right? Everybody's there. They talk about this new thing that's happening, and nobody even mentions the artifact anymore, and then everybody leaves. Game control sets in. It's you and the engineer character in the lab, and when I first played this, I immediately went over to the engineer character and went into my inventory, used the artifact, handed it over, got a whole scene out of it with them saying, oh thanks, now I can finally do the thing, it should be ready by tomorrow or something, and then I went about my business. And of course I was wondering, could I have not handed it over? Was it optional for me to do this? Right here, this was easy enough to do. I actually went back and I tried to leave the room without handing over the item. It turns out that if you try to do that, the game actually stops you. The engineer character will just talk to you and say, hey, isn't there something you wanted to give me? And you cannot leave until you hand the item over. Now, this might, again, seem like very little, but think of the amount of times in video games, and if you can't, I can think of a lot of times when this happens, where you already know that a certain thing has to be done, and you want to do it. You can do it right now, as in you could. There's no real story reason why you wouldn't be able to do it right now, but the game doesn't let you do it just yet. If it were in this example, you first have to move to the door before you get to hand the item over. And you sit there and wonder why. Why couldn't I have done it the other way around? Why are you wasting my time? If you cannot think of any instances like that, I implore you to pay attention to this kind of thing, because you'll probably notice a lot of instances like that. Especially in small situations like this. In this specific situation, there's no reason to prevent the player from handing over the item. Except, possibly, that the game itself doesn't have the mechanics to let you do it. It is inherently a little more risky and complicated if there is no explicit hand the item over mechanic in the game, right? Maybe the player just wanted to talk to the engineer character, completely forgot about that item, but now he makes the character hand the item over. In this specific instance, nothing bad would happen, but I'm sure you can immediately think of much more complicated instances where it is not entirely clear. If the player's intent with an action isn't entirely clear, should you even do anything there? And partially, I think the big issue here is that in a lot of games, not only do the designers not think about specific instances where the player might want to do a certain thing out of order because they have been paying attention, they don't have to get reminded, that you don't have to patronize them, but they don't think about this on a fundamental level, so even if they wanted to not patronize the player, they can't, because they haven't given the player the right tools to express their intent in these kinds of situations in the first place. And Growlanser is a game that fundamentally has a lot of those tools. I'm not going to say it's perfect about this integration of player agency, but boy is it better than most other games I've ever seen, in particular JRPGs. It is fundamentally a good game, in that it fundamentally is trying to integrate player agency and interactivity into, well, its entirety. If nothing else, and there's other reasons to really like Growlanser, it is in fact my second favorite JRPG series, I think this is the main thing I would like other people to take away from it. Fundamental integration of player agency into your game. Or, you know, the video game equivalent of show, don't tell. I really hope somebody can come up with a nice phrase for this and put it in the comments.